It's my deep pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Sharon Solomon. For those of you who are newer to the fellowship, I'll give you a few details about her life. She is the wife of our founder, Paul Solomon. And she has done just about every job you can think of at the fellowship through many, 40 years? Under the scenes, behind the scenes. And she was reluctant to be in front of the scenes, but we all knew she would be good at it and tried to give her a little shove. She was always back there supporting other people and getting up and expressing themselves. And I remember fondly when my daughter, who is now 40, was 2 years old, and Sharon had lived with our family for about a year and a half. Anyway, she was standing in front of the congregation speaking, and I walked in the back like you often do, holding your little ones. And my daughter got excited, and she pointed her finger with such anticipation and excitement. And when she called her Shashi, she always said Shashi, she goes, Shashi! And she fully expected wonderful things to happen. And so I remembered that this morning in thinking about how fortunate we are that Sharon is with us and has rich history, so many stories. I mean, she could talk for days about all the stories and the miracles and the growing pains and just the ups and downs of any organization and spiritual group. And she has stayed steadfast as a friend to many. She's always there if you have a need, and she comes from her heart. Let's open our hearts and minds now to give her a warm welcome.
So I remember that day too. It was really special. Paul Solomon was the son of a Baptist minister who was the son of a Baptist minister. All of his uncles were Baptist ministers. In his home growing up in the Ozarks of Arkansas, God was a living presence, as tangible as his parents, brother, or sister. That is, Paul was a typical child in a typical Baptist family, except for a couple of things. When he was about 4 years old, he informed his parents, "I have so much to do and so little time to do it." Also, he could see lights around people. And when parishioners would come to visit his home, he told his parents whether there were either good lights or bad lights surrounding them. Most of the people had good lights, and Paul thought everyone could see the lights. He learned differently when one day, when he was about 5 years old, he told his parents that a woman who had come to visit had bad lights. And his parents asked what he meant and told him that she was such a nice person. But about a week later, they found out the woman had stolen money out of the Sunday collection of their church. That scared his parents, and they told Paul not to speak about the lights. And he didn't, but they didn't go away. And then other strange things started to happen. When Paul was about 10 years old, he met a young black boy named Jada, and for several months they met near a pond to play with one another nearly every day. They continued to meet even after Jada died suddenly of a mumps epidemic. Paul hadn't told his parents about his meetings with Jada because at that time in the rural South, blacks and whites didn't socialize. After he learned that Jada had died, Paul realized he had another secret he couldn't talk about. Paul never studied. To get passing grades in school, he slept with his books under his pillow. He could also read from other people's notebooks from afar. And as a young teenager, once when he wanted to show off for his friends, he told them about a note a young girl had passed to a boy she liked. And the girl was really embarrassed, and she told the principal, and Paul's mother was called to the school. When she returned from her talk with the principal, his mother called him to the kitchen table, and he knew he was in trouble. She said, "We've known since you were a child that you could do things that other people could not do. When you use these talents for helping people, they are of God. If they're not used for God, then," she didn't say anything more, or at least he didn't hear anything more if she did. In his mind, he filled in the rest. If he was not of God, then he was of the devil. Paul was 14 years old, and that night he tried to kill himself. He slashed his wrist. It was pretty bloody, and the scars remained. After that, he stayed away from his strange talents and spent a lot of time praying. One day, desperate to understand what was happening to him, he saw a presence walking toward him, and he felt an incredible love from that presence and knew that Jesus Christ was his God and would never leave him. At the age of 16, Paul proclaimed before the congregation of the Baptist church where his father preached that he had been called to be a minister, and he was ordained as a Baptist minister. Even before his high school graduation, he began to work as an itinerant preacher, much as his father had done in his earlier years. He had a prison ministry and served as a music minister. Paul played the piano and the flute. He looked a lot older than his young years, and in those days, no one checked for ID as they do today. Still, he had never had a cigarette, a drink of liquor, or even danced, following the strict Baptist beliefs. Soon after high school, Paul joined the Army and served on a base in San Antonio, Texas, where he met his first wife. They had a child, and Paul was ready to start his ministry as a Baptist minister in the family tradition when his world fell apart. His wife fell in love with another man, and she left. In those days, in the early 1960s, there was no such thing as a divorced Baptist minister. And thus Paul began his dark night of the soul. And as he put it, for 5 years he made up for lost time. He tried his first cigarette and smoked the whole pack. He had a beer and then another, and then went on to stronger alcohol and drugs. In his own words, if there is anything he didn't do during those years, it was only because he didn't think of it. He worked as a restaurant manager, and during those years he also became a trained beautician when his sister bought a beauty salon. Now that's a very short, abbreviated version of Paul's early years. On at least 2 occasions when Paul told his life story, he took about 2 days to get to that point. So this is definitely not a complete story. Paul lived a very full life. One day, when Paul was sitting on his leopard couch in his apartment that he shared with 2 women, watching his pet hamster stepping on a wheel that went round and round but was going nowhere, he realized that that was the perfect illustration of his life. And he got really depressed. He knew he didn't want to live like that anymore. He tried to think of what to do. He thought about going with his father, but he knew his father would just tell him to go join the church and pray to God. Then he remembered that when he was in the Army, he had witnessed hypnosis sessions that had helped even catatonic patients. And he decided to find a hypnosis clinic. He found one, but when he inquired about what they could offer, they also told him the price, and there was no way he could afford it. And he grew even more depressed. So, lamenting his fate, Paul went to his favorite bar and recounted his sad story to his friend Harry. Harry said, "I hypnotized somebody once." And Paul said, "Let's go and try it." They went back to Paul's apartment, and Paul lay down. Harry swung a pendulum and started saying some words, and Paul said he thought Harry was about to bore him to death. The next thing he remembered, though, was waking up with severe abdominal cramps, with Harry jumping up and down with great excitement saying, "A spirit spoke through you." Harry and Paul later pieced together that first hypnosis session. It was February 1972. Paul was 33 years old. Paul began speaking in mumbling, incoherent tones when he suddenly jerked violently as if some unseen force had struck him in the solar plexus. Harry's anxiety increased when a powerful, stern voice began speaking through him. "You have not attained sufficient growth or spiritual awareness to understand contact with these records," it said. "That which you perform is a foolish experiment, for you attempt to harness powers you do not understand and to contact sources, records, or intelligences you are not familiar with. And how will you fry the spirits should you attain that you seek? Would you recognize him whom you do not know, have not been familiar with?" After the stern warning, the voice ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Paul's body doubled up as if hit in the abdomen again, and then he lapsed into an apparently normal sleep. Trying hard to conceal his excitement, Harry patiently counted his subject out of hypnotic sleep. Dazed, Paul awoke clutching his stomach. He was irritable and needed help to stand. Harry wanted to try again and find out more. Paul didn't. "What do you expect when you hypnotize a Baptist preacher? You got my subconscious mind," Paul said, and he threw Harry out. Harry came back the next day and the next, and kept returning each day, urging Paul to be hypnotized again. Paul threw him out each time until one day Harry said, "That voice couldn't be you. You're not that smart." He even had bought a tape recorder. That convinced Paul to try again, provided several questions be asked. Paul wanted to find a way to know whether this voice really had access to information that neither he nor Harry could know, but that could be verified. Have you ever tried to think up such a question? It took a while, but they finally thought of one. Paul's great-grandfather had been murdered, and there had been rumors in the family for years that he had left a great deal of money hidden somewhere, but no one had ever been able to find it. They would ask where the money was hidden. Secondly, Paul wanted to know what caused the stomach cramps and how to prevent them. And third, they would ask, "Are you a familiar spirit or guide, and can you give us your name?" So, on the second reading, Paul invited a skeptical friend to sit in too. Paul lay down, and Harry began his boring hypnosis routine. As soon as the voice began, it announced that the skeptical friend was in trouble with the authorities, and they would be glad to instruct him in correcting the problem as soon as he was ready to listen. For the present, the source, which they began calling the voice, which spoke in the communications, would only heal, the voice said they would heal his physical condition, which was the result of a drunken fight. And it did this immediately. The source then gave the location of the money. It was tucked away in the brick chimney of an old house where his great-grandfather used to live that had burned down. And they later found the money, and it was just enough for his grandmother to have heart surgery, which he desperately needed. The source said that the cramps were caused by the body's resistance to the consciousness leaving through the solar plexus, which simulated death. When the body realized that it wasn't going to die, the cramps would stop, and they did. To the question, "Who are you?" the source said, "Neither familiar spirit or guide is needed for the reading of these records. It is rather in yourselves, in your own development, that understanding will come and guidance, not from a lesser spirit, but from the throne of grace, that you may come before these records and read what you will for the instructions and development of those on your plane who would know more of the divine. Paul and Harry were advised to prepare themselves spiritually for what they could learn from this newly discovered phenomenon. Harry asked what they should do to prepare, and the voice gave a list of instructions, including reading the Bible, specific diet, and exercises. The source said, learn to pray, learn to meditate, and study sacred scripture. Then the voice said, write to the ARE to receive the Search for God books. What's the ARE, said Harry. The voice explained that it was the Edgar Cayce organization, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, and they gave the address, including the zip code. The first tape reading of the Paul Solomon source was completed. This time, Paul was able to listen to the voice himself, and he heard a stronger, more powerful version of his own voice. Now, both Paul and Harry wanted to find out more about this otherworldly source of information. Paul began to do readings every day, and he was convinced that he was not dealing with the contents of his subconscious mind. Vast possibilities beckoned, but there were so many questions. Concepts introduced in the readings, such as being psychic and of reincarnation, were alien to him because of his Baptist background. He remembered the frightening, guilt-producing events of his younger years that, in desperation, had caused him to attempt suicide. And the same question dominated his consciousness: is this of God or of the devil? The man he trusted most to discern was his father. With a tape recording of the mysterious voice in hand, Paul traveled from Atlanta, where he lived at the time, to South Carolina to seek his father's advice. Thinking his father would explain the voice as a tool of the devil, Paul played the tape and asked, "What do you think? Is this of God or the devil?" He was not prepared for his father's unhesitating answer. Looking his son straight in the eye, he said, "It is of God." Paul took the opposite side of the argument. "How can you know that?" he asked. "I know it is of God because for the past 5 years, your mother and I have prayed daily that something would happen to bring you back to God and to make your life meaningful. I knew it would have to be something spectacular. There's a scripture that says, which of you, if your child asks for a piece of bread, would give him a stone? Or if the child asked for fish, would give him a scorpion? I ask God to bring you back. That is how I know it is of God. You are communicating with the Holy Spirit. You go back and get to work. You do what that voice says to do. It is your life's work," his father said. The door was opened to a new life, and there was no turning back. The direction was set which Paul would relentlessly pursue for the rest of his life, introducing hundreds of thousands of people throughout the world to the limitless potential of growth and transformation. When Paul returned to Atlanta, he and Harry began their effort in earnest. As Paul lost consciousness during the initial readings, he became aware of a tunnel that stretched out, winding in and up like a cornucopia. Passing through the tunnel, similar to the tunnel described in those who have had a near-death experience, he encountered a lush green hillside with a mountain in the distance. At the top of the mountain was a temple. The temple contained a library of books. It was from these books that Paul was given information that was beyond his and Harry's comprehension. Paul began to make the journey up the sacred mountain and into the Hall of Records, as it was later called, each time he did a reading. As his program of spiritual growth continued, he journeyed up the mountain into the temple at the top and into the Hall of Records, an additional 3 times a day, every day, of part of his meditation discipline. Initially, Paul's experience of doing readings in the temple was consistent. Paul would climb up the sacred mountain with 7 terraced gardens, each of a different color, and enter a temple. Harry would ask a question or request information about a specific subject. Paul would go through shelves and shelves of books until somehow he would know how to stop at a particular one. The book would be taken from the shelf to him, would be opened, and then would disappear. Paul described the rest of the experience of being like a dream. He somehow knew that he was reading material in the book, yet the information would not come in words, but in memory. He felt as if he were remembering the answers. After the first few readings, Paul no longer experienced the long process, nor did he remember any of the information or the words and phrases used in the readings. In later years, often when he gave lectures in the same time span, the same words, topics, thoughts, and phrases would appear in the lectures as well as the readings. The lectures were obviously from source as well. And although Paul prepared for his lectures with study and meditation, he never wrote them out. He never spoke from notes other than an occasional brief outline on a complicated esoteric subject or a series of historical events relating to the knowledge. As the work progressed, it seemed that the seekers were drawn to ask questions in the readings that Paul and the group of students who studied with him were exploring in their own growth. In the first 6 months, Harry and Paul tried to think of meaningful, erudite questions to ask the source. What, for example, does the world need most to know? At last it occurred to them to go to the source and just ask it to tell them everything they needed to know. In response, the source said, "We can bring you the answers to the questions you ask. It is not meant that we should lead you by the hand. When you ask, you bring information. It is in your asking the questions that you unlock the source of information." Paul and Harry were sure that a particular question they had decided to ask the source would bring forth reams of material. It was a simple question. What is God? They entertained the naive notion that the answer would be sufficient for a whole book, and they could then publish the book. They were stunned when the source answered their question with a single sentence. A God is a being who can recognize good without evil as a point of reference. Let me say that again. It's so profound, I think. A God is a being who can recognize good without evil as a point of reference. Perhaps the question most often asked for the years, who or what is this unique source of information? Harry and Paul initially thought the source was a spirit talking through Paul. They hadn't the foggiest clue what was really happening. They had never heard of channeling or psychic readings. All of their lives they had been told that fortune tellers were of the devil, and they believed that the last of the prophets died in biblical times. They didn't know about spiritualism or out-of-body experience, and hadn't even considered the possibility of reincarnation. These topics were never mentioned in the Baptist home, and if you asked about them in seminary, it was grounds for being expelled, which Paul knew from experience. Suddenly, subjects totally outside of Paul's realm of knowledge had become a part of his experience. The naivete of both Paul and Harry is evident from their questions in the first few months. What is your name? What is it like where you live? Who or what are you? They asked, and the source replied, "This is not a spirit or some other person. You are talking with the rest of your mind." The mind that you think of as your mind is just the tip of the iceberg. There is much more to your thinking ability than that. The mind that you ordinarily think with is the result of your 5 external senses, observing the world around you and making judgments about what it sees, hears, and feels. It gathers information and makes logical conclusions. The mind is external, a body phenomenon, a result of the brain functioning. But the mind is not the sum of your intelligence. The source further explained, there is also intelligence that is inherently in you, that is not the result of brain functioning. The voice that you are talking with is the higher consciousness, the greater consciousness within you. It is the source of your brain functioning, the source of your mind, that which gave birth to your mind. It is also the source of your body, and it pre-existed your body. It made decisions about the color of your hair and eyes, about the physical characteristics about your physical body. Its relationship might best be described as the child of God, or the only son that God ever had. If this is the source of our consciousness, the part of us that pre-existed our body is the only son that God ever had, then what about Jesus Christ? Paul and Harry asked. And the source said, not only Jesus, but others have experienced the fact that God only gave birth to one child. When one gives up his individual identity, when one no longer thinks of himself as separate from other people, he too knows that he is the only son. It is that same son that you speak with when you call him by the name of Jesus Christ. Though you don't have to be religious to communicate with the source of your being, this is not a humanistic approach. The source further explained, the intelligence that made you is an aspect of God that lives within you, and it is so close that is cohabiting the same body that you live in. Harry wanted to know if this communication with Source was unique with Paul, or could he learn to communicate with it as well? The Source gave a series of responses on how Harry and others could learn to communicate. The Source said, the phenomena of the rest of your mind, the superconscious, the greater intelligence, is not peculiar to one person. Everybody has a whole mind, and most of us access only about 1/10 of its capacity in daily life. Right now, cells in your body are actively dying. You could get alarmed about that, but simultaneously another phenomenon is occurring. You are replacing those dying cells with new cells, new life, as cells are being reborn. The intelligence inside you knows how to make new life, knows how to cause your heart to beat, knows how to heal you. That intelligence is coexisting in the same body with you. It is that intelligence that made you. It is the creator of your brain, your consciousness, your eyes, your ears, all of you. If that intelligence gave you your ability to communicate, surely it can hear you and knows how to communicate with you. That same intelligence is available to every person. It is not necessary nor even desirable for a person to go into trance or completely lose consciousness as Paul did, the Source explained. Paul, in fact, lost consciousness not because he was hypnotized, but because he wanted to escape consciousness. His desperate desire to escape life allowed him to reach the unconscious state. The Source assured Harry that anyone could enter a subtler reality, a different reality, and from that space they could ask questions and receive answers from the source of their own being. Whether or not you communicate with Source effectively is dependent on where your attention is focused, the Source further explained. If you can pay less attention to what is going on around you and spend time every day quietly seeking communication with the Source of your mind, you can learn to communicate with it as well, at will. This was not a new philosophy, Paul realized. He had studied these principles all his life. His father had taught him the same thing, but had said it in different words. His father said, if you learn to pray, to ask questions, and become quiet, to listen not with your external senses, but within you, you will contact the Christ, develop a personal relationship with him, and you will be born again. Universal law works, Paul then understood, because they are truth. Whatever words you use to express them indicate your cultural background, but don't change the laws. The same universal laws apply to everyone. All of us can develop our own personal relationship and have a two-way conversation with Source, with Jesus Christ, with Allah, with the Buddha. People throughout Atlanta began to hear about Paul Solomon and his work and flocked to his home. It was a difficult time for him because many were desperate people who couldn't find help anywhere else. He was surrounded by them and knew he couldn't help them all. He asked the Source what to do. The Source replied, if a man is hungry and you give him a fish, you have fed him once. If you teach him to fish, you have fed him for a lifetime. Teach people to get their own answers. Use the information that you were given and teach other people to find answers within themselves. Paul compiled the teachings he'd been given by Source for his own growth and began to present them to people who came to him for help. Thus, Inner Light Consciousness, a guided experience in spiritual evolution, was born, and Paul brought its teachings around the world. Paul continued to give trance readings as well and added the valuable discoveries of Inner Light Consciousness, producing many workshops and programs. In thousands of hours of trance readings for individuals and lectures for hundreds of thousands of people around the world, Paul Solomon has made available instruction on virtually every phase of human existence. There are medical diagnoses and suggestions for treatment which have proven to be accurate and curative. There are prophecies which have been borne out in fact. There are teachings on loving self and others unconditionally, on effective communication, emotions, mastery, and building loving relationships. There is a wealth of instruction in spiritual growth and enlightenment, and teachings of ageless wisdom from religions and cultures from the beginning of time. Paul Solomon compiled the disciplines, the universal laws, meditations, and exercises in a complete system for development of spiritual growth and abilities. The Fellowship Credo, which Lloyd read this morning is in your bulletin, contains the essence of these teachings. I came to the Fellowship of the Inner Light in 1975, 3 years after Paul's first reading. The day I first met Paul, my friend with whom I'd shared discoveries in spiritual growth, had telephoned me and introduced the concept of a spiritual teacher, a person who could present a path to the knowledge of God. That night, Paul came to speak at the Metaphysical Center in Wayne, New Jersey, where I was taking classes. As soon as I heard him speak, I knew he would be my teacher, though I must admit I really hadn't the slightest idea what a spiritual teacher meant. I took Paul's Inner Light Consciousness class and then came to Virginia Beach to work as his secretary. I did just about every job possible at the fellowship through the years. Paul and I were married in 1987, and I love him still with all my heart. Through the years, I have seen countless miracles. Paul died in 1994. He was 54. Like he said, he was a little boy. He had a lot to do, little time to do it, and he accomplished a lot. His teachings live on in our own Virginia Beach Fellowship of the Inner Light Center and around the world. Paul's greatest dream was to inspire others to strive to reach their full potential. the quest that became the greatest single focus of his life. Like other great spiritual leaders, prophets, and teachers throughout time, Paul didn't emphasize his own unique abilities, but to his teachings, pointing always to the greater teaching, the God within. He trained teachers to carry on his work, and the wealth of information remains available today. With this focus in mind, we are committed to continuing his work. Thank you.